How did Cain die? The answer is we really don't know for sure. The Bible doesn't tell us about the death of Cain. But over the years, the sages of the Midrash had something to say about this matter. Working with various clues from the biblical text, the sages patched together an account of how the man who committed the first murder met his own demise. The story they tell is bizarre and haunting. At face value, it borders on the absurd. But Midrashic stories are not necessarily meant to be interpreted at face value. They often use the language of allegory to point to deeper underlying currents in a story. For all its improbability then, the story the Midrash tells about Cain's death may be quite truthful indeed. Let's begin our look at the Midrashic elaboration with an eye towards the biblical clues that it is based upon. As near as we can figure it, these are some of the issues that nudged the sages towards their view of how Cain died. First, we have an unexplained fear. The Torah records that after Cain killed Abel, the Lord imposed a number of punishments upon him. In response, Cain turned to God and expressed his concern that his own demise will not be long in coming. In Genesis chapter 4 verses 13 to 15, we read, "And Cain said to God, 'My sin is greater than I can bear. Anyone who finds me will kill me.' God replied to him, 'Therefore, anyone who kills Cain will be avenged sevenfold.' And God placed a mark upon Cain, so that all who find him will not kill him." We might ask, why exactly does Cain feel so vulnerable? It is true that God has imposed a number of punishments on him, from difficulty farming to exile, but he has not decreed that Cain deserves to be killed. Why then is Cain so worried? Moreover, who are exactly these other people that Cain fears will do him harm? The world's aggregate population was pretty tiny at the time. Besides his parents and Mrs. Cain, there aren't too many others around. So who really is Cain afraid of? Rashi, grandfather of the medieval commentators, is bothered by this question. His answer, which originates in the Midrash, is that the killers Cain feared were not men, but animals. That is to say, Cain was worried that in the wake of his act of murder, a beast might devour him. Does Rashi solve this problem? Well, perhaps he explains who might kill him, but he doesn't seem to explain why. why will Cain, all of a sudden, worry that animals will kill him? God didn't command animals to avenge Abel's blood. What's more, if Cain had the means to defend himself adequately against the animal world before he killed Abel, he presumably had these same capabilities afterwards too. So why does he all of a sudden become afraid? So Cain's fear of death is one oddity, but it is not the only one. Another strange thing is God's response to his fear, his promise to Cain that whoever kills him will suffer sevenfold vengeance. Why, for starters, would God want to promise such a thing to Cain? It is one thing to soothe Cain by telling him that he will be protected from would-be killers. But why extend to Cain, who is a murderer, the assurance that one who kills him will be punished 7 times more severely than the crime warrants? God didn't extend his courtesy to Abel, the innocent victim of murder. So why should he extend it to Cain, Abel's killer? And there's another problem too. What exactly does sevenfold vengeance really mean? Presumably, the worst thing God could do to a killer of Cain by way of vengeance will be to kill that person himself. But that's not sevenfold vengeance. That's just plain vanilla vengeance. It's a simple tit for tat. Where does the 7 part fit in? A strange verse, tucked away at the end of the story of Cain and Abel, may hold the key to answering these questions. Just after the Torah tells us of Cain's punishment, it goes on to give a long list of genealogical tables. We hear all about Cain's descendants, who gave birth to who and how long they lived. Many people might wonder why the Bible felt it necessary to include all this apparent trivial information. But if you stop and actually read these genealogical tables, you will find something curious. The Torah goes into a great amount of detail about one particular family. A family which appears at the very end of the chain of descendants. We are told the names and professions of each child, and then strangely enough, the text quotes, verbatim, a short and cryptic declaration made by the father of these children. In that speech, the father speaks about having killed a man. And he also speaks of the sevenfold vengeance of Cain, as well as vengeance that will be exacted against him, this latter-day killer. And what's more, if we bother to count all the who begat who's in between, we will find that this mysterious mention of murder occurs precisely at the 7th generation removed from Cain. An interesting possibility begins to unfold. Maybe these verses are describing somehow the carrying out of the mysterious vengeance of Cain. Maybe the phrase sevenfold didn't refer to the severity of the vengeance that someone will be killed 7 times over, but to the time at which it occurs. Maybe the promised vengeance will take place after a sevenfold lapse in generations, and maybe this is precisely what we are reading about at the end of Cain's genealogical table. Such a possibility bears, at least, further exploration. So let's take a closer look at these strange events that occur 7 generations removed from Cain. What happened at that promised 7th generation? Only a few details are clear. We are introduced to a man called Lamech, who we are told has 2 wives and 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. We know their names. The 3 boys are Yaval, Yuval, and Tuval-Cain, and the girl is named Naamah. Yaval becomes the father of all shepherds and tent dwellers. Yuval becomes the father of harps and cymbals, that is, the inventor of the first musical instruments. And Tuval-Cain is the inventor of ironworks. He is the first person to fashion metal weaponry. The Torah tells us that one day, Lamech convened his 2 wives and made a strange speech to them. "Listen to my voice, wives of Lamech, hearken to my words, for I have killed a man to my injury, and a child to my wound." Yes, 7-fold was the vengeance of Cain, and Lamech 77. Lamech's declaration is difficult to decipher, to say the least. He talks about having killed a man and a child, and refers strangely to the promise of his ancestors' 7-fold vengeance. What does he mean to say? The sages of the Midrash gathered the various puzzle pieces of this story and constructed a parable that seeks to give meaning to it all. And it is here that the Midrash tells us how it thinks Cain died. According to the Midrash, this is what happened. Lamech was a 7th generation descendant of Cain. He was blind, and he will go out hunting with his son, Tuval-Cain. Tuval-Cain will lead him by the hand, and when he will see an animal, he will inform him. Then the father will proceed to hunt it. One day, Tuval-Cain cried out to his father, "I see something like an animal over there." Lamech pulled back on his bow and shot. The boy peered from afar at the dead body and said to Lamech, "What we killed bears the figure of a man, but it has a horn protruding from its forehead." Lamech then exclaimed in anguish, "Woe unto me! It is my ancestor Cain." And he clapped his hands together in grief. In doing so, though, he unintentionally struck Tuval-Cain and killed him too. This is really a strange story. We hear of a hunt gone wrong, with a blind Lamech shooting arrows at the beck and call of his overeager son, little Tuval-Cain. We hear of an elderly Cain being mistaken for an animal, walking around with a strange horn protruding from his head. What exactly was Cain doing parading around the forest in a unicorn costume? One thing seems clear though. According to these sages, the man that Lamech killed through his injury was none other than Cain, and the child he struck to his womb was his own son Tuval Cain. If we put 2 and 2 together, the Midrash seems to be saying that when God talked about sevenfold vengeance for Cain, he wasn't talking about punishing Cain's murderer. Instead, God was talking about punishing Cain himself. He was promising that Cain himself would be killed in vengeance for Abel's murder, but that his will occur only after a sevenfold lapse in generations. So where did Cain get that unicorn costume from? Why did he have a horn, of all things, sticking out of his forehead? It is time to revisit, one last time, the story of Adam and Eve in Eden, the story where the cascade leading to Cain and Abel first begins. We noticed a while back that the Cain and Abel narrative is speckled with connections between it and the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. There is a triad of consequences: exile, difficult farming, hiding from God. All these things beset mankind after they eat from the tree, and these same consequences reappear only more intensely after Cain kills Abel. The Torah seems to be saying that the Cain and Abel episode is a further chapter in the story of the tree of knowledge. That Cain's act of murder was fundamentally similar to Adam and Eve eating from the tree. It was just another chapter in the same saga. If we had to boil down that saga to just a single simple sentence, what would we say that these two linked stories are about? They are about what it really means to be a human being and not an animal. In Eden, humanity was accosted by the primal serpent, an animal that walked, talked, and was apparently an intelligent being. The snake was very nearly human, and it begins his words with, "Even if God said don't eat from the tree, so what? God may have told you not to eat of the tree, but those words are belied by your desires. Do you want to eat it? If so, God is talking to you through that desire. He put those instincts inside you, and you obey God by following them." In making this argument, the snake was faithfully representing the perspective of the animal world. The dividing line between man and animal lies in how one perceives that God speaks to him. Does God speak to you in the form of commands or in the form of desire? Animals, such as snakes, follow God's will not by listening to His words or His verbal commands, but by obeying their passions, their instinct, the voice of God inside them. The snake, quite innocently, holds out the possibility that perhaps man should adopt the same approach. The voice of desire for an animal always reigns supreme. In the act of reaching for the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve succumbed to the snake's argument. In buying the argument that for man too, one's internal desire could be the final arbiter of God's will, mankind lost a little bit of who he was and became a little more snake-like. In the wake of that failure, God punishes all the relevant parties. The snake's punishment, though, is particularly interesting. He is told that from then on, he will eat dust, will crawl on his belly, and that hatred and strife will henceforth reign in the relationship between his progeny and the children of Eve. The common denominator in these three punishments of the snake seems evident. The snake will become more obviously different, a being that crawls rather than one that walks, a being that subsists on food that men will never touch, and a being whose sight and presence registers instinctive alarm and enmity in the collective psyche of humanity. The snake will become more obviously animal-like, more clearly removed from the realm of man. Having failed once to distinguish himself from the animal world, mankind will no longer be faced as subtle and dangerous a temptation. But man's struggle to defend himself in relation to the animal world is not yet over. The story of Cain and Abel was a further battle in the same war, a war centered on how man is meant to relate to his passions, the creative will that surges inside of him. Cain became enamored with his ability to create in partnership with God and became entranced by the products of that enterprise. In the end, he sacrificed everything, his relationship with God and the life of his own brother, on that altar. As the verse suggests, he had in effect used Abel's blood as fertilizer for the ground. The life of a brother had become a regrettable but acceptable casualty of Cain's continuing, intoxicating quest to bring forth life from the ground. Blind desire had once again had its way. In the wake of that basic failure, Cain intuited a self-evident truth. He will now fear the world of beasts, not because beasts will be interested in avenging Abel, but simply because they will perceive that Cain really was not at all different from them. The days of comfortable distance from the world of the jungle were now behind him. Cain pleads to the Almighty for protection from these newfound threats, and the Lord accepts to the request, giving Cain a mark that will protect him from those that will molest him. We wondered earlier why it was fair that Cain, a murderer, would merit special protection from death at the hands of others. But that mark, the Midrash is saying, was not some supernatural sign promising heavenly retribution to anyone who would harm Cain. Nor was it some artificial device that would convince the animals that Cain really was an animal to be feared after all. Instead, the sign, as the Midrash tells it, was a simple animal's horn. Having become vulnerable to his new compatriots in the world of the jungle, it is only fair that Cain can be given a horn, the same means of defense available to any other beast. In a savage twist of irony though, in the end it is precisely the horn given to Cain for protection that does him in. Little Tuval Cain sees Cain's horn and immediately assumes that he has seen a beast. Upon closer examination though, the boy isn't so sure. The body of the figure is man-like, and he can't figure out whether the being he killed is man or beast. He can't tell, perhaps, because he can't see well. That's his father's problem, not his. But because the identity of his prey really is uncertain, Cain has crossed into the no man's land between man and animal. Cain, the person who feared he would be killed by an animal, is killed because a person couldn't tell whether he was in fact a man or an animal. The story the Midrash tells is interesting, not only for the way it portrays Cain, but for its view of Cain's killer as well. The image of Tuval Cain and Lamech, the child and the blind hunter, is a memorable one. To fully understand its significance, we should take a quick look at the larger extended family. Tuval Cain is the child weapon maker and has two brothers. The names are Yuval and Yaval. If you replay the names of these three siblings over in your mind, they should sound vaguely familiar. Yuval, Yaval and Tuval Cain. What do they remind you of? Well, if you're used to reading the Bible in English, they might not remind you of much. But if you switch to Hebrew, the resonance in these names is unmistakable. The Hebrew original word for Cain is Cain, a word that reappears in the appellation given this descendant, Tuval Cain. Likewise, the Hebrew name for Abel is Hevel or Haval, which sounds suspiciously similar to Yaval, the brother of Tuval Cain. The resemblance goes beyond the names too. Just as you are told the professions of Cain and Abel, we are told the professions of Tuval Cain and Yaval too. And you wouldn't know it. The professions adopted by these seventh generation descendants bear an eerie similarity to the arts practiced by their forebears. Cain or Cain was the world's first killer, and Tuval Cain, his namesake and descendant, makes weaponry. Abel or Haval is the first shepherd in history, and his namesake and descendant in the seventh generation, Yaval, is the father of traveling herdsmen. These connections did not go unnoticed by the sages of the Midrash. The rabbis commented about Tuval Cain, for example, that his name signifies that he perfected the arts of Cain. Cain killed without benefit of tools. Tuval Cain comes along and by forging weaponry, gives the art of killing a technological boost. One can argue that Yaval, the seventh generation heir to Havel or Abel, does likewise. He perfects the art of Abel. Abel the ancestor grazed his flocks, but Yaval pushed the envelope further. As Rashi puts it, he, the father of herdsmen, constantly moved his tents, transporting flocks from pasture to pasture to ensure a virtually never-ending supply of grassland. These great leaps forward all take place in the seventh generation from Cain and Abel. Seven, in the Torah, is a number laden with symbolic significance. It often signifies completion, the bringing of a process to its culmination. God finished creation in 7 days, bringing the universe to its finished state of being. After 49 years, that's 7 times 7, we celebrate Yovel, the Jubilee year, in which freedom is proclaimed throughout the land. Everything attains a new homeostasis, everything achieves a new balance. Debts are forgiven and slaves are released from the servitude. Here too, at the end of 7 generations, the lines of Cain and Abel reach their perfection, their final fruition. In the case of Cain, that destiny bears ominous overtones. His 7th generation descendant, Cain, the metal worker, takes the art of killing to new and more powerful levels. Levels that would have otherwise been unimaginable to Cain himself, the ancestor of it all. But such is the way of things. We don't always have control over forces we put in motion. Cain is powerless to stem the lethal forces he has begun to unleash. Forces that culminate in the personage of Cain. But ironically, Cain and Lamech, the new killers, are in their own ways just as powerless as well. When you get right down to thinking about it, the partnership of Cain and Lamech has to be the craziest hunting duo one can possibly imagine. Cain spots a leopard at 100 paces and calls out the coordinates to his father. Lamech, who can't see a blasted thing, wheels around 60 degrees to his left, takes a moment to calculate range and trajectory, then lets his arrows fly. The image of a child weapon maker leading around his blind father on hunting expeditions is comedic but chilling. Neither the father nor the child is in control. Neither is quite aware at the awesome power they so irresponsibly wield. Both are powerful engines, but nothing of consequence guides either of them. A quick survey of blind men in the Bible turns up an interesting pattern. Lamech, according to the sages, was blind. Isaac, towards the end of his life, suffered from failing eyesight. And so did Eli, the high priest mentioned at the beginning of 1 Samuel. Sensing a commonality here, the sages of the Midrash commented, "Anyone who raises a wicked son or trains a wicked disciple is destined eventually to lose his eyesight." The sages are not doctors, and the observation they are making, arguably, is not medical in nature, but spiritual. Why would a father who raises wicked children eventually become blind? Perhaps the sages are not talking about the physical inability to see, but an emotional blindness, a deep-seated unwillingness to see. Isaac can't bring himself to face the true nature of Esau, and Eli can't bear to face the sins his sons commit. These otherwise prescient fathers are blind to what is obvious to all others around them. When reality is too cruel to see, the best among us can easily make ourselves blind to its horror. In the view of the Midrash, Lamech, just like Isaac and Eli, is blind. It is not so much that his son is evil. After all, Cain is but a child. But the dangers of his craft are entirely lost on the oblivious father. There is a kid out there making sawed-off shotguns, and instead of restraining him, Lamech invites little Tuval out for hunting parties. Lamech can easily rationalize the deadly arts of his son. After all, it is not guns that kill people, but people that kill people. And if all my kid does is make the swords that others use, well, that's a good clean living, isn't it? The mandate of the parents is to guide their children, but in this case, it is little Tuval Cain who is the leader, guiding with devastating inaccuracy the arrows of his blind father. The seventh generation is the apogee. The generations of Cain are slowly spinning out of control. Tuval Cain really is Cain perfected. Cain failed to rule over the raging passions that beset his soul, and Lamech failed to rule over the raging power of his young son's killing machines. 7 generations from Cain, nothing has changed. It is just that stakes have gotten higher. The legacy of the forbidden fruit is alive and well. Mankind becomes even more snake-like as raw power, left to its own devices, consistently overwhelms its bearer. The children of Lamech are the last descendants of Cain that the world will ever know. The Great Flood, the ultimate destruction of humanity, is right around the corner. A glimmer of hope, though, beckons to humanity. Right after the Torah finishes telling us of Cain's 7 generations of descendants, indeed, immediately after Lamech's disastrous pronouncement of 77 times vengeance, the Torah tells us something fascinating. We hear of a second chain of generations, which begin with the birth of a child named Shet. This is recorded in Genesis chapter 4 verse 25. Shet was a third born to Eve, a son born after Cain killed Abel. And the text tells us that Shet, in Eve's mind, constituted a replacement of sorts for her murdered son Abel. Interestingly, the list of Shet's descendants is introduced with the words, "These are the generations of Adam," as if to say somehow that these are the real generations of Adam. And they really were. After all, Abel was murdered and had no children. Cain's children are wiped out after 7 generations in the Great Flood. It is really only his last child, Shet, who allows the generations of Adam to continue in perpetuity. For as the verse goes on to tell us, Noah, the saving remnant of humanity, is a descendant of Shet. Strangely, as you begin to go through them, the descendants of Shet sound a lot like the descendants of Cain. For example, Cain has a descendant named Metushael, and Shet has a descendant named Metushelek. Cain has a child by the name Chanok, and Shet has a descendant by the same name. Curiously, Seth's immediate offspring is a child named Enosh, a word which has come to mean man, and the child of Enosh is Canaan, a word which seems a variation of Cain or Cain. It is as if Seth's own line of heirs contains a mirror of Adam himself and a mirror of Adam's son, Cain. Well, it can't come as too much of a surprise that 7 generations after Enosh, this second Adam, we are greeted with the birth of a child named, yes, you guessed it, Lamech. In case you missed the point, this second Lamech just happens to live to the ripe old age of 777 years. So when all is said and done, at 7 generations, each line, the line of Adam 1 and Adam 2, come to their apex. But whereas the first Lamech gives birth to Tuval-Cain, a son who becomes a partner in the destruction of life, the second Lamech gives birth to a son who will allow for the perpetuation of life. The child of Lamech too is a man by the name Noah. While the 3 sons of Lamech 1 die in a flood, the child of Lamech 2 builds an ark. And yet, while the child of Lamech 1 perished in that flood, the legacy of Lamech 1 is not erased entirely. One of his children, according to the sages, survives. According to Midrash, Naamah, the sister of Tuval-Cain, becomes the wife of Noah. So a daughter of Lamech 1 survives by marrying the son of Lamech 2. In that union, humanity comes full circle. The doomed line of Cain merges with a spark of life from Seth, the man who, according to Eve, was a replacement for Abel. At long last, the legacies of Cain and replacement Abel have come together as a father from one line and a mother from another unite to create Noah. When we look back on Cain and his legacy, it is easy to disregard him, to feel that mankind is better off without having to deal with the wickedness that he manifests. But evidently, Abel, or his replacement, is not enough of a foundation upon which to build a new world. Cain, for all the danger he brings to the table, is a necessary partner. Somehow, mankind needs the energies of both Cain and Abel, that is ground, coupled with nothingness, possession, bound together with breath, to move on, to build itself in perpetuity. And so it is that, in the personhood of Noah and Naamah, under the life-saving roof of an ark, a fragmented humanity finally gains a semblance of unity, just as the storm clouds of apocalypse gather on the horizon.